It's kind of like secretly hoping for more snow than was predicted. Sorry. But really, there are times where consequences reach much farther than we imagined. And today we're going to look at examples of this, especially early on in Genesis, so that we can learn from them. Last week we ended in Genesis chapter 3 as mankind made the choice to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the consequences of this are enormous. In verse 9 of chapter 3, the Lord called to Adam and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard your voice in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked and hid myself." He said, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I command you that you should not eat?" The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave of the tree and I ate." And the Lord said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." So the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all the cattle, more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and hers. He shall crush your head, you shall bruise his heel." To the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception and pain. You shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be to master your husband, and he shall rule over you." Then to Adam he said, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I command you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you are taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Fairly well-known verses. And we see the consequences for what they did, well, in our lesson last week. How man, woman, animals, the earth is all cursed, and it still is with the consequence that we still face today. Today we still have to toil the ground. Today we still have thorns and thistles produced on the earth. These consequences from, if you're a young earther, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, if you're an old earther, millions of years ago, whatever. Since the dawn of time almost, we still face these consequences today. Do not underestimate the power and reach of sin and death. It is dangerous to do so. Do not underestimate the consequences of sin. At this point I want to bring up, do not underestimate the consequences of righteousness either. In all but one of the examples we're going to look at today, early on in Genesis, we will see the consequences of evil and sin and corruption. We will also see the consequences of righteousness and faithfulness to God. To underestimate either one of these things is to sell them far short of what they are capable of. Consequences can be both positive or negative. Good has long-term effects too. We see this in Genesis chapter 4. The consequences of righteousness and evil as Cain kills his brother. As Cain commits the first murder on planet Earth. This is what God says to him. He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. Cain's consequences, his punishment, follow him his entire life. In fact, Cain goes on to say, whoa, if you do this, whoever finds me is going to kill me too because I'm cursed. So God marks him. Says, if anyone brings harm to you, they'll receive theirs 7 times over. Cain's punishment is enormous. Consider at this time, God's already told them that they've been given the herb of the field. They have to go and grow their food. If it does not yield its strength to him, he becomes a scavenger almost. His consequences are enormous. They affect everything in his entire life for his whole life. But notice, Abel's righteousness still speaks to us today. Over in the book of Hebrews, we talked about this when we talked about chapter 11, basically the hall of the heroes of faith. And this is what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 11, starting in verse 4. He says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks. Abel's righteousness still speaks to us today, according to the Hebrew writer. And so we see that consequences can have long-term effects, both negative and positive. Abel's blood is later used in chapter 12 in comparison to the blood of Christ, saying that Christ's blood speaks of better things than that of Abel. To underestimate the power and reach of sin is to be overwhelmed by it. Remember, God warned Cain that sin was lying at his door. In fact, his exact words are, if you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin lies at your door, and its desire is to master you, but you should rule over it. Sin's desire is not to simply muddy up the waters a little bit, trip us up just a little bit. The desire of sin is to master us, to rule over us. And if we underestimate the power and reach of sin and its consequences, we will quickly find ourselves overwhelmed and underprepared to fight back against it. On the other hand, if we underestimate the power and reach of righteousness and faithfulness to God, we're going to find it so much more difficult to stand in His strength. God has given us the blood of His Son so we could remain righteous before Him. We need to realize that the consequences of that are much stronger, are much greater than we might see directly ourselves. In Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we see a world in sin and a man of God. We see a terrifying world overcome with sin and evil, and a consequence that would end it all. Starting verse 5 of chapter 6, we read, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry I have made them. I made the comparison before that if you think the world's bad today, in Noah's day, you see that the only intent of the thoughts of the heart of men was only evil all the time, only evil continually. At least we have some bright spots in our world today, yes? What a terrifying world to live in. Completely overcome and overpowered by sin and evil. Yet, one man remained faithful to God with his family. One man out of the population of planet Earth at the time remains faithful, and the consequence for his faithfulness would save the planet. In chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, the Lord said to Noah, after building the ark, come into the ark. You and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 of each animals that are unclean, a male and his female. Also 7 each of the birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of the earth. For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things I have made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. The result of one man's righteousness and faithfulness before God saved the planet. We just talked a minute ago about how we can underestimate the power and reach of righteousness and faithfulness before God. Here's your example. I'm going to do a little thought experiment here. If you're in Noah's shoes at this time, living righteously, living faithfully to God, and you realize that the entire population of planet Earth has turned away, and the only thought of their heart is continually evil all the time, do you think that you're being effective? Do you feel that your faithfulness is changing the world at that moment? Chances are I would say no. Put yourself in Noah's shoes before God says, hey, it's time to build an ark. We have no indication that Noah had any idea that God was going to use him to save the planet. Only that Noah lived faithfully before God. In all likelihood, having no idea the consequences that his righteousness would have for everyone and everything since then. Please do not underestimate the power and reach of living righteously and faithfully before God, regardless of what is going on in your world. It goes much further. At the same time, again, do not underestimate the power and reach of righteousness, because it very nearly wiped out all life on the planet at one point. As we've seen before last week, grasping at and conflicting with God drives us away from Him. It's conformity that draws us closer. It's conformity with God's will. It's conformity and becoming more like Him that draws us closer to God. When we come into conflict with that, when we grasp at that, very quickly find ourselves in trouble. In Genesis chapter 11, we see people grasping at God as they say, "We will make a name for ourselves." In chapter 11, verses 5 through 9. Now remember, God had told mankind to fill the earth and subdue it. Take care of his creation as a whole. Mankind chose not to do that. They chose to gather in one place. Then they decided to build a tower that would reach the heavens, to make a name for themselves, lest they be scattered over the face of the earth. In verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over all the face of the earth. At this point, mankind is scattered for good. Consequences, by the way, which we have still not recovered from. We still have how many languages on the earth? I think last count was 700 or 500, some huge number. Different languages, different cultures, different ethnicities, things that have forced mankind to spread. Yes? Consequences that we still face today. How many wars have been started because of differences of culture or language or misunderstanding? How much discrimination has taken place because someone is different from the other? We still face the consequences of this today. Consequences, as we said, reach much further than we often imagined. But there is good news here. And the good news in this is that we can choose something different. We can choose a life of holiness. We can choose a life where we follow what God's will. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, during the Sermon on the Mount, the very beginning parts of it, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing but be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a bowl, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." In his first letter, Peter writes in chapter 1, starting verse 13, he says, "Gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober. Rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts, as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, 'Be holy, for I am holy.'" The good news is we can choose something better than sin and its consequences. We can choose righteousness and faithfulness toward God. We can choose to live a life of holiness and faith under the power of the blood of Jesus Christ. Living a life of holiness brings us closer to Christ. As we conform more and more to His will, more and more to His ways, living a life of holiness gives others the opportunity to know Christ. As they see our conduct and realize that something's very different about these people that I've noticed. Living a life of holiness can and will reach much, much further than we expect. Yes, sin and evil and corruption has consequences, and sometimes those consequences can follow you all the days of your life. But we can choose to live under something better. I have someone close to me who some years ago got wrapped up in drugs in a big way. Wound up trying to rob a drugstore with an empty gun. The people he was trying to rob said they weren't even scared because they could tell he was so gone that he wasn't even functioning right. But he did have to go to jail for some years. That will follow him. The consequences of that action will follow him his whole life. But he chose something better to live under. While in prison, he got clean. He busted himself to work and work well and work ethically and work with integrity in the prison. He went on to find a job outside to the point where he actually got into a program they had at the prison where he got to go to work for a few hours a day and then come back. Where he continued to work with integrity, with faithfulness. Where he turned himself back to God. Yes, the consequences of his actions will follow him his whole life. But he lives under something better. He lives under something bigger. He lives under something more powerful than those consequences of what he's done. And he realizes that and recognizes that. In fact, he credits that arrest and his going to prison with saving his life because he realizes he would have died of an overdose or something. Now, that doesn't make doing drugs and going to prison and all that suddenly a good thing. But it does make it a bad thing that God has redeemed for his purposes to bring someone to his side. Which is the lesson we'll be having in a few weeks. Consequences of a life of holiness can and will reach much further than we expect. Now, yes, we must accept the consequences for our failures. If we refuse to do that, then we're missing the boat. We must accept the consequences for our failures. We must admit our mistakes, admit our failures and our sin before God so that we can have something better. But at the same time, we must also accept the consequences for our victories. We must accept the consequences of choosing Jesus Christ. We must accept the consequences of living a life of holiness under Him. Consequences which often are very, very good for us. Which are always good for us. I've heard so often from different groups, people accepting the horrific consequences for their sins and their failures, But then when they've chosen good, when they've chosen victory, when they've chosen righteousness and holiness and faithfulness to God, when they've chosen to walk the path of Christ, all of a sudden for them to say, yeah, I don't really, I'm just bad, and that's just, I'm just a terrible person, and I just happen to fall upon the right path. Accept the consequences for a life of faithfulness and holiness. Accept the consequences for receiving the victory from Jesus Christ by the power of his blood. It's all from God, but he brings us in to take part in his story, to take part in his victory. It's Jesus Christ who's won the victory over sin and death. Make no mistake. But he has allowed us to become his children. He's allowed us to become, as Paul writes in Romans, co-heirs with Jesus Christ. He's allowed us to be soldiers in his army, to take part in his victory, to take part in his story. We can and should rejoice in our good times, just as we mourn the bad, just as we mourn our failures. We should strive to live lives of holiness in order for the good consequences of our walk with Christ to shine through. I want to encourage you, I want to implore you to let your salt be salty in a good way. To let your light so shine before men so that when they see your good conduct, they may praise your Father who is in heaven. You may be in a position like Noah. We look around and say, well, what good is it doing? You don't know. You do not know what seeds you're planting, for good or for ill. You do not know where those consequences will end for living faithfully to Christ. You may know where it ends for you. Eternity with him in heaven. But on this planet, we don't know where those consequences will end. We don't know just how far those consequences will reach. But it's been my experience that they are always much, much further than we imagine them to be. It's my prayer and my hope that as we rise up today, that we will be salt and light to this world, that we will bring forth the good consequences of faith, living lives of faith toward God. That we will reject sin. So the consequences of our life in Christ can shine through all the brighter, all the better, all the stronger. That we truly will be lamps set up on a stand, giving light to a dark world. Our community needs this. Our state needs this. Our country needs this. Our world needs this. This neighborhood needs this. Will we be the light and salt that we need to be? Will we accept the consequences for our failures? Accept the consequences for our victories? And live lives of faith so that the consequences of that faith will be felt resoundingly through all the surrounding areas. So I encourage us to do it as we stand and as we sing.